Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to today's KADIT seminar. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to briefly introduce KADIT, the School of Comparative History of Religions. KADIT organizes seminars, lectures, and academic discussions in the field of history of religions and related disciplines with the aim of supporting comparative, interdisciplinary, and scholarly engagement with religious traditions. And we are like the only group in Turkey who makes this like academically and continuously. Then today's lecture is our final meeting in this seminar series, and it's entitled The Relationship of Gnosticism with Ancient Christianity and Judaism. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dylan Burns. Dr. Burns is assistant professor of the history of Western esotericism in late antiquity at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on ancient Gnosticism, Nag Hammadi literature, Platonism, late ancient philosophy, Manichaeism, and the wider field of Western esotericism. He is the author of Apocalypse of the Alien God, Platonism and the Exile of Scythian Gnosticism, and Did God Care? Providence, Dualism, and Will in later Greek and early Christian philosophy. He has also co-edited the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Codices. We are very grateful to have him with us today for this final session. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Dylan Burns. Dr. Burns, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to talk about some really difficult but really fun questions, namely the relationship of ancient Gnosticism with Christianity and Judaism. All right. I'll begin by offering a kind of timeline as a way of refreshing and orienting everyone to the world of earliest Christianity and how it relates to Judaism. Then I would like to introduce what I would call the Coptic Gnostica, which I think occupy the bulk, the center of scholarly research into Gnosticism today. You may have heard already in this lecture series of the Nag Hammadi Codices, which belong to the Coptic Gnostica, but actually there were other Coptic Gnostic Codices before Nag Hammadi. And I will talk then about Gnostic studies before the Nag Hammadi discovery, especially emphasizing the influence of esotericism on scholarship relating to pre-Nag Hammadi work on Coptic Gnostica, as well as the so-called History of Religions school. Then, of course, I will turn to the Nag Hammadi discovery itself and the ramifications of the Nag Hammadi discovery for evaluating the relationship of Gnosticism to Judaism and early Christianity. So, plenty to do in 45 minutes. We'll see if I get to it all. But let's just take a quick timeline to take ourselves back to the Roman Empire of the 1st and early 2nd century CE. And the dates on this timeline, some of them are certainly debatable, and especially those, the Gospels are being redated these days, but the points that I'll derive from them, I think, stand regardless of how you quibble with the dates. So, of course, Jesus of Nazareth was probably born around 5 BCE, and his ministry and death lasted approximately 3 years, terminating in 30 CE. It's not long after that that man persecuting members of the Jesus movement, when Saul of Tarsus converts on the road to Damascus to this movement and becomes the apostle to the Gentiles, of course, the apostle Paul. Not long after that, Paul comes into a clash with the apostle Peter about whether or not Gentile converts must keep the law. In other words, people interested in Christianity were shocked to discover that they no longer could eat shellfish, and certainly circumcision as a prerequisite for table fellowship, that is, eating together, celebrating the Lord's meal, was also an issue. You can, of course, read all about this in the book of Acts and Paul's letter to the Galatians in the New Testament. And as this is going on, meanwhile, there are philosophers. Now, Paul himself was famously influenced by philosophy, especially Stoic thought. But there are also Jews in this period who are turning to scripture, and the case of Philo of Alexandria, who we're going to turn to in a moment, scripture in Greek translation, and asking philosophical questions about scripture. So, as I mentioned, Philo of Alexandria is a contemporary of Paul, a Jew living in Alexandria in the 30s and 40s, highly influential and important in his community. And he's bequeathed to us a wealth of literature where he wrestles as a Jew with philosophical and exegetical questions. He is more or less our one surviving major Jewish philosopher of the Roman Empire. The kinds of questions Philo asked were like this. He says, this is in his work, Why God is Unchangeable. Why then does Moses speak of feet and hands, goings in and goings out, in connection with the uncreated? Why again does he speak of his jealousy, his wrath, his moods of anger, and the other emotions similar to them, which he describes in terms of human nature? What Philo wants to know, in other words, is why, if God is transcendent and God is a divine being, and therefore, according to Greek philosophy, a happy being, a good being, a being incapable of jealousy, why then is God described in the Hebrew Bible as having body parts? Okay? And why God is described as having not only emotions, but negative emotions, like anger, jealousy, and wrath. What does Philo make of this? I could tell you, but you should go read for yourself. It's on page 60 of the Loeb Classical Library translation of Philo. Not long, now Philo lived, as I said, in Roman Alexandria, and actually served as part of an embassy to the court of the Emperor Caligula to address the question of what to do with the statue that Caligula instituted of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. Thankfully, Caligula died before Philo got there. He didn't have to deal with Caligula himself. But the whole episode illustrates that while Judea as a province in many respects flourished under Roman rule, there were also tensions. And eventually, these tensions exploded into a tremendous war between Judeans and the Romans that lasted from 66, roughly from 66 to 73 CE, culminating in the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70. It's probably not long after this that the Gospel of Mark, referring to the destruction of the temple, was composed. And in the decade after that, most likely that the self-designation Christianos, that is Christian, was probably first used, as we read about in the book of Acts. The Jesus movement has thus spread from a movement of itinerant prophets and evangelists, like Paul himself, traveling around the Roman Empire, spreading the word, to a movement that has a sense of self-definition apart from Judaism, and also begins in the early 2nd century to build institutions, that is, churches, communities, ecclesiae in Greek, with leaders, deacons, and bishops. Against that backdrop, there is another revolt against the Romans that becomes a violent conflict spreading across North Africa and Egypt, the so-called Second Jewish War of 115 to 117, and then a third revolt, this time in Palestine, extending from 132 to 136. On the slide, you see a coin that was actually minted in Palestine when under the auspices of the then Judean government. After the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the final suppression of Jewish revolts in the early Roman Empire, we see other philosophers asking questions about scripture. But this time, these are Christian philosophers, people not just interested in the portrayal of God in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, like Philo was, but Christians interested in taking passages from the New Testament, passages from Paul, as well as Jewish passages from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and interpreting them in light of contemporary philosophy. And one such Christian philosopher was a Platonist named Valentinus, active in the 140s and 150s CE. Valentinus, we mainly know from the attack written against him by a bishop located in Gaul, what is today France, named Irenaeus, written towards the end of the 2nd century against heresies. Irenaeus writes, Valentinus adopted the fundamental principles of the so-called Gnostic school of thought. The word school of thought here, translated from Greek, it's heresis, okay? So which is a word that at the root of our modern English word, heresy. But in the 2nd century could also have simply indicated a philosophical sect or a school of teaching. So Valentinus, Irenaeus says, adopted the principles of the Gnostic heresis to his own kind of system. Here is what he laid down. Then Irenaeus goes on to tell us all about it. So here are some takeaways from this timeline. Why all of these dates? Why this long story? First, the emergence of Christian identity as separate from Jewish identity is the central story of Christianity in the 2nd century. And it takes place in a period where many Jews became rebels in open conflict with the Romans, with disastrous results. At the same time, the relationship of Christian to Jewish identity was commonly argued with respect to adherence to the law. So think of Paul and the Jerusalem Council, his debate with Peter, and increasingly Christians' production of their own scripture, like the Gospel of Matthew, like the Book of Acts, and eventually the writings of Valentinus, scripture that maintained its own authority vis-a-vis the Jews. You do not see bishops, that is, people claiming formal authority over multiple churches in the 1st century, but they start to emerge in the first decades of the 2nd century. And this whole time, philosophers are around, elite members of Jewish and Christian communities, well educated in the world of Greek philosophy, are asking hard questions about scripture. This is the background against which Gnosticism emerges. If you want to explain why you have criticism of the God of the Hebrew Bible that is so intense in Gnostic literature, if you want to understand why you have criticism of Jews in Gnostic literature, if you want to understand why you have the simultaneous engagement, criticism of Judaism and Jewish traditions, and yet an embrace of these same traditions, all presented against the backdrop in the language of Greek philosophy. This is the background that you need to make sense of it. We're dealing with a period where Christianity and Judaism are still very much intertwined, but beginning to emerge as separate identities from one another. And a lot of the people writing the texts that form the evidence we have describing that transition are people who are highly educated and, in particular, making use of Greek philosophy. Now, people in groups like what Irenaeus associates with the Gnostics start to disappear by the 4th or 5th century CE. Okay, so there are other writers against heresies after Irenaeus, lots of them in the 3rd and 4th centuries, many of whom who are copying Irenaeus and his text, who's had things to say about the Gnostics. But once you get into the Byzantine period, 8th, 9th centuries, there's a lot less writing about the Gnostics. They don't seem to have been a force around for people to contend or argue with, unlike the Manichaeans, right? So there is some reception of Gnostic ideas in the medieval world. Manichaeism is a great example. Bogomilism, Catharism, other such dualisms of the medieval world. But for the most part, all that was known of the Gnostics after late antiquity was what Irenaeus said about them, okay? And you could turn to other heresiographers, but for the most part, they are simply copying what Irenaeus wrote. Until the discovery of the Coptic Gnostica. In the late 18th century, books written in Coptic, the youngest phase of the Egyptian language, so a language that is purely Egyptian in its grammar, but making wide use of Greek vocabulary, as well as some including syntactic or grammatical markers and particles, and written mostly with a Greek alphabet, adding over half a dozen extra characters, depending on the dialect, to replicate Egyptian sounds. Books written in Coptic begin to be discovered. Now, Coptic was used as an active language from roughly the 4th to the 14th centuries CE in Egypt. It is, remains the language, the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians, so-called Copts, named for the language itself, used alongside Arabic in Coptic churches. And a European explorer named James Bruce, traveling in North and East Africa in the 18th century, brought back lots of books to England in the 1760s and 70s. And one of them is the so-called Bruce Codex, or Codex Brucianus. A codex is simply a word for an ancient book. Bruce, by the way, brought lots of interesting manuscripts with him back to Great Britain. So not only did he bring the Bruce Codex in Coptic, but he is also responsible for transmitting the earliest manuscripts known to me, at least, of Ethiopic Enoch back to Great Britain. So the introduction of Enochic literature and Ethiopic Enoch, or as it is known today, First Enoch, okay, was introduced to the West by Bruce at this time. Anyways, Bruce brought back this codex, which is now named for him, which is actually several different manuscripts that were bound together at some point. The codicology of that is the book making, the binding of the codex is really complicated, but it's clear that it's actually several different manuscripts that were put together at some point in time. And the Bruce Codex is full of the kind of teaching about the ascent of the soul through various aeons, that is, spheres of light constituting heaven, that are described by Irenaeus and the heresiographers in connection with the Gnostics. And as you can see in the photograph here, you have also these really cool diagrams. In the middle, you have this depiction of what seems to be a thesaurus, or a treasury, a place for the soul to ascend to, presumably after death, and the sigils it needs to know, and the names it needs to know to bypass the gatekeepers to that level of heaven. And you see the writing around the diagram is, of course, in what looks like Greek letters, but this is Coptic. Not long after that, a doctor named Anthony Askew discovers in a London bookstore another Coptic text full of the names of various archons, that is, demonic rulers, as well as angels that can assist the soul in its ascent to heaven. This long codex, today called Pistis Sophia, since it follows the travails and adventures of one of these aeons, these hypostases or manifestations of divine thought, faith, wisdom, Pistis Sophia, is now also kept in the in the United Kingdom. It was, like I said, found by Anthony Askew in 1772. We don't know its provenance before it came to that London bookshop, but it was translated into Latin in 1848, and French and German translations followed in the 1890s. A few decades after the discovery of the Bruce and Askew codices, there is a spike of interest in Gnosticism among 19th century writers, artists, historians, and one such historian was Jacques Mater, who in his critical history of Gnosticism coins the term esotericism to describe what he called the gnosis of the ancient mysteries, the content of the teaching of the secret Gnostics, secret Christian wisdom, the Jewish Kabbalah of Pythagoreans and Egyptians in Alexandria. So in the 19th century, there begins to emerge the notion that there was a mystical doctrine common to various traditions in the Roman Empire that was special and only taught to a select few. And it went under the name, the code name, the School of Alexandria, or the teaching of the School of Alexandria. The association of Valentinus and other Gnostics with Alexandria was very important for this myth-making of an ancient, esoteric, mystical teaching of the second century, which could be recovered in modernity. There was also a strong interface with magic, the relationship of Gnosticism to magic over the course of the 19th century. So the mid-19th century is not just the time when these Coptic Gnostic codices first begin to be discovered and translated, but also when Greek magical papyri and demonic magical papyri begin to be brought to Western collections from Egypt, following Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, a lot of looting of Egyptian antiquities in the early 19th century, the decipherment of hieroglyphics, and so forth. There's tremendous Egyptomania in Europe in the 19th century, and interest in the magic of the Orient, of the Egyptian Orient, also peaks. And so the discovery of formularies, that is, books of spells during this period, was of great interest to scholars who began to look at them and translate them. Well, it turns out some of the books of spells that were found in Egypt in the early and mid 19th century and were being translated in this period were compiled by relatively well-educated individuals. So it's hard to say who wrote the spells. These have a very unstable tradition. Sorcerers are always doing, making their own notes, making their own changes to spells when they copy them down. But we know, for example, that alchemical texts were discovered alongside grimoires, that is, books of magic at this time. And alchemists in the early Roman Empire, we know, were interested in Gnosticism. One of the most important alchemists of the 4th century, Zosimus, also clearly shows knowledge of Gnostic myths, Gnostic teachings, as well as Manichaeism, by the way, in his own writing. And so the scholars in the 19th century began to see a relationship between Gnosticism and magic. Some of them referred to the newly discovered magical papyri as being Gnostic because they also described ways to get control over demons and angels through magical rituals, much like you had described in the Bruce and Askew codices. We see an illustration of such a grimoire here, one of the London magical formularies, PGM 7. And so the relationship of Gnosticism, not only to Judaism and Christianity, but to the School of Alexandria, a kind of esoteric teaching that was a philosophical specialty of Alexandria in the first centuries, as well as ancient magic, and specifically Egyptian magic as practiced in the Roman Empire, was embraced by writers of the so-called occult revival of the 1880s and 1890s, especially the proponents of theosophy. Madame Blavatsky and her secretary and literary executor, G.R.S. Mead. Blavatsky and Mead both were reading Pistis Sophia and the Bruce Codex and some of the newly published magical texts. And they believed that this material transmitted the true theosophical teaching, alongside, of course, their interpretations of Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese religions, and of course, Kabbalah, Christianity, and Islam. The Theosophists influenced Carl Jung, who read Irenaeus for himself, and even wrote a sermon from the perspective of one of the most famous of the Gnostic teachers that Irenaeus wrote about, Basilides. This is, of course, the 7 Sermons to the Dead, a really interesting work, actually. So Jung, the teacher about the collective unconsciousness, the animus and the anima, and so forth, identified himself as a Gnostic, okay? He believed that he belonged in the same lineage of Alexandria Gnostic teachers as did Basilides and Valentinus. He was highly interested in magical texts, also influenced by early studies of ancient alchemy that highlighted the commonalities between Gnostic and alchemical teaching and their association with magic. And he was led in this direction in large part through the influence of the Theosophists. So to a large extent, Jung, in his understanding of Gnosticism, is practicing Theosophy himself. So much for what's going on in England. Over in Germany, there's a new school of criticism that I'm sure your group has engaged with quite a bit, was emerging, called the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, so-called, or History of Religions School. So these are scholars who were really excited about the newly translated Babylonian, Egyptian, and Persian texts that had become available in the 19th century. The 19th century was a period of the decipherment of ancient languages and vast new productions and translations of vast translations of bodies of ancient literature that had not been available to scholars before. So scholars, especially in Germany, wanted to use all of this newly translated ancient material, especially from the Near East, especially from pre-Christian Oriental cultures, right, to rethink the developments of early Judaism and Christianity. And Gnosticism was really important to their theories. Their methods and conclusions were demolished by Carsten Kolpe in 1961. And the approach of the History of Religion School is, I think, best explained with reference to the criticisms of it by Kolpe himself. And I summarize a summary of Kolpe by another scholar, Edwin Yamauchi, whose book you see on the right. First, the History of Religion School saw themselves as being able to decode or rethink the beginnings of Judaism and Christianity because they thought that the sources they were using from Babylonia, from Persia, from Egypt, were all older than the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. But this wasn't always true. Subsequent scholarship on, for example, Persian texts like the Avesta show that a lot of our surviving Zoroastrian literature are actually medieval productions kept in medieval manuscripts. It's very hard to speak confidently about Persian literature prior, I should say Zoroastrian literature, Zoroastrian literature prior to the birth of Christianity. For our summaries of Zoroastrian teaching, we rely in large part on Greek sources up until the medieval period. And you can find other examples of the use of late sources that the History of Religion School thought were quite early. Mandaism is another good example. They use parts for whole argumentation. Now, this is a fancy way of saying they cherry-picked their evidence. Okay, they would take one thing and extrapolate a lot from it while neglecting other aspects of the evidence that might contradict their arguments. They played a lot with ambiguous passages in the New Testament and generally fell victim to what we might call parallelomania. They operated under the false assumption that parallels between texts and traditions indicate dependence between texts and traditions. Correlation is not causation, however. They often appeal to the authority of famous scholars rather than analysis. And this is key for us. They operated under the false assumption that non-Christian is the same as pre-Christian. Okay, so if you have a manuscript or a text from the Roman Empire or the medieval period that has no Christian references in it, the history of religion scholar often looked at that text or manuscript and argued, because there's no reference to the New Testament, it has to be a pre-Christian work. If it were post-Christian, then it would engage the New Testament in some way, shape, or form. This is very important for Gnosticism. So to summarize, the earliest modern English language research on Gnosticism was intertwined with the emergence of the very ideas of esotericism and occultism, and then even Jungianism. Theosophy, esotericism, and Jungianism were all strongly impacted by the discovery and then early translation and interpretation of the Coptic Gnostic Bruce and Askew codices. Meanwhile, in German scholarship, the History of Religion school hypothesized that Gnosticism was a pre-Christian phenomenon, syncretized from Oriental, Hellenic, and Jewish elements. Whenever the History of Religions scholars found pieces of Gnostic evidence that didn't have Jesus in them, they assumed this was evidence that Gnosticism itself is a pre-Christian religion of some form that was later Christianized in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And both of these perspectives colored the earliest reception and interpretation of the Bruce and Askew codices, the first new evidence to emerge about the Gnostics between the Antiquity and the 19th century. All this changes in 1945, where another body of Coptic books are discovered that wind up on sale in a Cairo bookstore in Zamalek in March 1946. So the first sighting of Nag Hammadi books is actually in March 1946 at the antiquity shop of Mr. Mansour. But subsequent investigations from 1946 until 1950 into the provenance of the codices were able to track them down to a town in Upper Egypt called Al-Qasr, the closest railroad stop to which was the railroad stop for a city, Nag Hammadi. Thus, we refer to these books as the Nag Hammadi codices. They are 13 Coptic manuscripts made or buried around the 4th or 5th centuries CE. They contain about 52 treatises, depending on how you mark the beginning and end or relationship of some of these treatises to one another. And they offer way more data about the Gnostic school of thought than was previously available. Some of the Nag Hammadi texts are clearly versions of those known to Irenaeus and other heresiographers, like the Secret Book of John. This is a work that is actually transmitted in 3 Nag Hammadi manuscripts, as well as a codex now kept and preserved in Berlin, the Berlin Gnostic Codex. So 4 manuscripts altogether. This clearly contains material known from heresiographers like Irenaeus. Irenaeus paraphrases parts of this text. And indeed, at least one other Coptic Gnostic Codex has been surfaced after the Nag Hammadi discovery. Of course, I speak of the Chacos Codex, which contains the infamous Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 70s and first published in 2006. I say at least because who knows how many more Coptic Gnostic codices are still on the black market that we don't know about yet. Now, what was the impact of all of this new data on our understanding about Gnosticism? One of the big things is a focus on biblical background. The Bruce and Askew codices are pretty spacey stuff. They're not very easy to read, and to a large extent, they give lists lists of the names of aeons and angels. This is part of why it was easy to read them against magical texts at the time, magical literature often being also occupied with lists and formulas. The Nag Hammadi texts give us many more narratives, texts with stories, beginning, middle, and an end. And they also strongly engage biblical literature. So in Nag Hammadi Codex 9, for example, we read a scathing critique of the God of the book of Genesis in a work called The Testimony of Truth. Here, our author asks, of what sort is he, this God? Now, first of all, he was jealous of Adam, insofar as he ate from the tree of knowledge. And second, he said, Adam, where are you? For God did not have foreknowledge. That is to say, he did not know from the start what would happen with Adam. And if he has shown himself to be an envious malefactor, in Coptic we read someone who is jealous and does bad, okay? And he is a God. Of what sort of a God is he? Truly great is the blindness of those who read this story and did not understand it. So we read severe criticisms of the God of Genesis and Exodus and other texts from the Hebrew Bible in the Nag Hammadi codices. At the same time, though, we see lots of elements of ancient Judaism in the same texts. So to simply refer Gershom Scholem, the pioneer of Jewish mysticism, to ancient Gnosticism as metaphysical anti-Semitism. Okay, is this just anti-Semitic literature from antiquity? No, this is wrong. These texts are also deeply engaged with Jewish text and tradition. They belong on the spectrum of ancient Judaisms. So there's a great deal of interest in the Nag Hammadi literature and rabbinic Jewish techniques of retelling or expanding on biblical stories. So one thinks, for example, of the Targums, these Aramaic retellings of biblical stories, and Midrashim, exegesis of biblical passages with comment. We just read a Midrash. This is you could read this as a text critical of the God of the Jews, but you could also read it as a Midrash on Genesis 2-3, right? It's both. In the meantime, rabbinic texts tell us about heretics. The Hebrew word is minim, who are associated with teaching that there's more than one God. And the notion of there being two gods in heaven is also a strong feature of early Jewish mysticism, the so-called Merkabah or Echolot literature. So this led scholars to ask, well, were the ancient Gnostics simply heretical Jews, members of Jewish communities who were critical of the God of the Jews following the Jewish revolts, but who were also interested in mystical stuff? And one such scholar who was very interested in these theses is Berger Pearson, who is pictured here in Cairo working on deciphering the Nag Hammadi codices in an undated photo from the 1970s. And Pearson argued that many of the classic Gnostic texts that survive, including in the Coptic Gnostic corpus, are actually just Jewish texts. And when you read references to Jesus or the New Testament or the disciples in this literature, these are add-ons. These are things that Christians in antiquity added to this literature to Christianize it, to claim it for their own. Coptic scribes may have done the same. So to take the example of the secret book of John depicted here, okay, this is a text with long passages where Jesus is talking about where the universe comes from, how it was made, the composition of the soul, where the soul will go after death, what will happen at the end of the world, right? And while the literary frame for the text is Jesus talking to the disciple John, there are long passages where neither of them appear. To Pearson, this was a sign of Christian, of the imposition of a Christian frame narrative on pre-existing Jewish material. He states, when one removes from the Apocrypha of John the apocalyptic framework at the beginning and end, together with the dialogue, features involving the 10 questions put to Christ by his interlocutor, one is left with material in which basically nothing Christian remains, except for some easily removed glosses. What is more, these vary in extent from one version in the various manuscripts to another. The conclusion is that the Christian elements are altogether secondary, and the basic material is a product of Jewish Gnosticism. He gives social historical context for the development of Jewish Gnosticism, arguing that ancient Gnosticism developed in large part from a disappointed messianism. Again, think of the failed Jewish revolts in the 1st and early 2nd centuries, or rather, as a transmuted messianism. This is the messianic spirit transmuted to metaphysics from the historical plane. Jewish history is not without parallels to phenomenon, as Gershom Sholom's studies of the Sabbatian movement attest. Now, when I was a student, 25 years ago, beginning my own explorations of Gnosticism, Pearson's material was still one of the viable options for explaining what Gnosticism is, how it relates to Judaism and Christianity. And even 10 years ago, I was at a conference speaking on this topic, the relationship of Gnosticism to Judaism, and specifically ancient Jewish mysticism. And one of the scholars in the audience said, well, why can't we just go back to what Berger Pearson argued? You know, well, I'll tell you, here are the problems with the Jewish origins thesis, Berger Pearson's interpretation of Gnosticism. First of all, the rabbinic evidence about the Minim, the so-called Jewish heretics, is inconclusive. They could be anybody. Note that the rabbis do not call the Minim Gnostics. They don't use any name having to do with knowledge or anything like that. It's not clear that the rabbis know the same people, are complaining about the same people that Irenaeus is concerned with. Secondly, every single ancient report about Gnostikoi, that is so-called knowers associated with teaching about an evil demiurge and the aeons and so forth, refers to them as Christian adjacent, okay? So they either say they are Christians, they're impersonating Christians, they hang out with Christians, always involved with Christians in some way, and usually involved also with Platonism, by the way. Philosophy comes up again and again and again. We could have given this whole lecture on Gnosticism as early Christian philosophy of a kind. Third, every single manuscript of extant Gnostic texts is a Coptic Christian production, okay? So all of our surviving Gnostic manuscripts are Coptic manuscripts, and this means they are Christian manuscripts. There is no Coptic that is non-Christian. It is the language of Egyptian Christians. And the fact that this literature is transmitted in Coptic shows that it is very closely related to Egyptian Christianity at the nexus where we have the best evidence for the manuscripts themselves. Finally, the absence of Jesus in an ancient biblicizing text need not indicate Judaism. There were all kinds of biblicizing movements in the Roman Empire that were not Christian nor Jewish. Manichaeism, Mandaism, Alkasaism are all examples. So what about the relationship of Judaism and Gnosticism today? Well, on the one hand, recent scholarship has focused on apocalypticism. Almost all surviving Gnostic literature is apocalyptic, okay? The word apocalyptic derives from Greek, apokalypsis, Latin translation of which is revelatio, meaning revelation, uncovering. And it refers to revelatory literature, that is, literature that describes the transmission of knowledge from heaven to beings on earth about whatever topic. And the association of such revelations with interpretations of world history and the end of the world are present in our canonical Bibles today, the book of Daniel, the Old Testament, and the book of Revelation, the New. So we use the word apocalypticism or apocalyptic to refer to things having to do with the end of the world. Now, apocalypses are very strongly represented in the Gnostic corpus. And so a lot of recent work has, including my own work, has focused on the relationship of the Gnostic apocalypses to Jewish and Christian apocalypses from the Roman Empire. Why did they use this genre? What kinds of common motifs and themes do we see, and what does that tell us about the relationship between Gnosticism, Judaism, and Christianity? So we might say that Judaism and Gnosticism have a shared biblical or even para-biblical heritage, where there are in Gnostic, where we see in evidence about Gnosticism, receptions and transformations of the biblical heritage in novel ways. And some of these receptions of traditions, some of the traditions that are received or transformed in surviving Gnostic evidence, including the Coptic evidence, are evidently very old, going back to the Second Temple period, to the period before the temple was destroyed in 70. And a great anecdote for finishing and to sum up this complex relationship, this engagement between Gnosticism and Judaism, actually comes from fieldwork on Mandaism. So Jorunn Jacobsen Buckley, the great Norwegian scholar of Mandaism, not only has done great work on the history of Mandaism and the interpretation of ancient and medieval Mandaean texts, she also has done anthropology of Mandaism, interviewing Mandaeans, because Mandaism is the last surviving Gnostic religion. Manda means gnosis or knowledge in Mandaic, and the Mandaeans, therefore, are literally Gnostics, people who claim to possess saving knowledge. So she talked with a Mandaean from Iraq named Majid Arabi al-Khamizi, who was living in New York. And Mandaeans are traditionally goldsmiths by trade. They work with gold. And so when he came to New York, Majid took up work in Brooklyn with the Hasidim, that is Jews also working with gold. And he said, "We are so similar, the same clothes, the same habits, the same humor, everything." I was amazed. Majid beams. I, Jorunn Jacobsen Buckley, asked him whether the Hasidim knew that he was a Mandaean, whether they knew what that meant. No, they didn't, and they didn't care. But what they knew is that he was not a Muslim. To the Hasidim, Majid was some kind of Christian. Then Majid asked me the question he seems to have pondered for years. Are they Mandaeans? Are we Jews? That's the question. Thanks very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for this lovely presentation. Now we are entering to the Q&A part. I mean, I was going to ask also for a conclusion, but this end was perfect to conclude. And while we are waiting for the questions, dear friends, you can send as a message. I can read it loud, or you can just talk. But I have one question, also, sure, which is related to it with our last conference. That so, what you say is like just like in Christianity, this Irenaeus, Tertullianus, or like this line. We can also find a line in Gnosticism coming also through the ages to today with Carl Jung or with Blavatsky, or maybe just popped in my mind with the other new spirituality forms like Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, and so on.
Yeah.
But with Nag Hammadi and with Alexandrian literature, yes, we can create relationships also with Johannine literature and so on. But how are we going to understand then, for example, the Persian Gnosticism, or like the Zoroastrianism and the influences? Because this creates like a very strong line, and the others I could not understand truly.
Well, the relationship, it's a great question, so, and the way I interpret your question is, where does Persia fit into this, right? Because for we're dealing with the Eastern Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, and so the lines between the Roman Empire, the Parthian, and then the Sassanid empires subsequently, they're going back and forth, yeah. And we can also identify pockets of the answer is, I think, to explain the Gnostic phenomenon is impossible. We don't have evidence that allows us to tell us why people began to develop myths that were critical of the God of Genesis and how this became mixed up with teaching about the aeons, which I think is actually a kind of Platonism. It's the idea is that there are immaterial causes for material things, a divine mind, and this fits with Platonic philosophy of the period. So, in short, the earliest evidence we have about Gnosticism deals with would be Irenaeus's testimony about very early Gnostic teachers like Basilides and Saturninus. And these are people teaching around 110, 120, 130 in Egypt and what would say in Palestine. Now, the beginning of the 2nd century, this is the reason I belabored this timeline, is to emphasize we don't even have a difference between Christianity and Judaism yet in this period. This is not just very old for Gnosticism. This is just old for Christianity, period. Okay, this is a period contemporaneous with the production of the Gospels, earliest Christian literature. We have very little evidence about what was going on at that time. So how that syncretism happened, where Basilides got it from, I don't know. Nobody knows. That's just the first record we have of that sort of thing. And it's actually from somebody who lived, 70 years later. So even that's suspect, right? Again, so to return to the question of where Persia fits in, I couldn't tell you if Basilides was reading Persian texts or not. What I can say is there are pockets of our evidence about Gnosticism that where we need to use Persian evidence to account for what it looks like. So the great example would be Manichaeism. Arguably, kind of is it Gnostic? Not exactly. I think it's difficult to conceive of the development of Manichaeism without reference to Gnosticism. Mani seems to have been aware of some of this stuff, but he was living in the Sasanian Empire, okay, and even operated and died at the Sassanid court. So this shows that some of these myths had gotten as far as Central and East Persia by the middle of the 3rd century. And then we have texts like the Hymn of the Pearl. This is a beautiful hymn or song preserved in the Acts of Thomas, which probably goes back to the late 2nd, early 3rd century CE. And this text also shows a lot of signs of Persian influence. So it's very hard to say whether, to what extent Persian texts or traditions impacted this material. There's one other angle we could put on it, and that goes to Judaism, actually. Demonology is important for Gnosticism. Gnostics don't talk about Satan very much because they have the evil demiurge. The evil demiurge is already kind of a satanic figure. If you make the creator of the world bad, that's actually kind of identifying the creator of the world with the Satan of the New Testament, who is Lord of this earth. That's what the devil tells Jesus out in the desert. He tempts him. And the New Testament also describes various kinds of demons that are inhabiting Palestine and making people sick. Scholars today read the demonology of the New Testament with Satan and the figure of Beelzebub, the story of Legion, the demon who is one and many, possessing a man in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, against the background of demonology in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Qumran community, the Jewish sectarian community on the Dead Sea from roughly the 2nd century BC to the 1st century CE, is not just writing a lot of apocalyptic texts, but they're writing a lot about demons. And they have a strong conception of God as being the force of light, themselves as belonging to that force in some way, as opposed to the forces of darkness in the world, which are led by a counter God, a demonic entity that is so big, he's leading a war against God. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, this figure is often referred to as Beliar, but he has many names. And scholars today generally think of this dualism that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls between dark and light, Beliar and Yahweh, as influenced by Zoroastrian dualism, as influenced by Persia. So if Gnosticism develops in the background of ancient Judaism and Christianity, and its theory of the demiurge and his archons, the rulers, is indebted to demonology of ancient Judaism and Christianity, it is genealogically also dependent on Zoroastrian dualism.
Yes, thank you very much. The other friends, if you have any questions, we still have like 4 or 5 minutes for it. But what you say is fascinating and also creates actually a different kind of understanding of Christology. That actually with this line we can follow the Gnostic roots of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, through the Greek literature and also the Pauline literature, and again with the Gospel of Matthew, because of the connection with this deep Judaism.
Yeah, demonology is very important for the Synoptic Gospels. It's all over the earliest stories about Jesus. He healed people by exorcising demons, right? And Mani was very good at this trick too, it seems. So I think the strongest case you could make for the impact of Persian religion and Zoroastrianism on early Gnosticism is actually through the demonology that Gnosticism shares with Judaism and Christianity of the period.
Maybe I can ask a question. Would it be possible to Professor?
Yes, of course.
Professor, thank you very much. It was a beautiful sharing information about all this documentation. There is this Bodmer papyrus I think we should be taking into consideration when we're talking about the Jung. I think we skipped so many philosophers and writers on the 1st century to 2nd century about all these Gnostic issues, which is also a part of the Neoplatonism. Professor, I have something bothering me in my mind with whether it is an academic way of asking or not. Are you Jewish, Professor?
Am I Jewish?
I mean,
yes, I am.
You are Jewish. So it is natural that you looking from the eye of a Jewish academic to the issues. When I am researching all these papers and the books, I find this attitude of connecting everything with the Jewish mythology, Jewish religion, and the Jews. I admire you. I myself is a researcher, so many times I've been to Solomonic Temple. But I want to tell you something. Maybe you are kind enough to reconsider in your thoughts the issues. There is a Hermetic philosophy before the Gnostic religion. That is a tradition of Egyptian. And then Mr. Brock, Professor Brock, classifies this as a second religion on his Gnostic description of the Gnosticism, with the Gnosticism here and the Hermetic religion is here. Yani he considers Hermes Trismegistus as a separate religion synthesis. Sometimes we see this as a state religion of the Egyptians. So we have the Egyptian religion here. And somehow these guys are trying to make it survive all the centuries, educating the philosophers and passing to the following generations. And we have Professor Brock's views, and we have
By the way, Mr. Sevsebil, unfortunately, our time is up. So maybe let's let Professor to talk and then finish the meeting. But thank you very much for this contribution, because I think also it's very important.
Okay, I couldn't ask, Professor. I am sorry. I am always watching your university's reels and the videos, and I am fascinated how it is all the universities equipped to take the Hermetic knowledge into the hands of the Jewish thought. And I admire it.
Thank you for your question. So, thank you. The relationship of this stuff to the Hermetica is fascinating. And one of the debates in scholarship, I don't have time to get into it. We're at the end. But all I can say is the relationship of the Gnostic material I talked about here to the Hermetic material, the teachings ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus, produced probably around the same time, okay, but with much less interface, or some would argue no interface at all, with Judaism and Christianity, okay? So a non-Abrahamic theosophical Gnosticism, yeah? This is something that scholars debate. And I have colleagues who think the Hermetica preserves authentic Egyptian teaching, that the Gnostics colored with their own biblical Abrahamic and arguably dualist teaching. I disagree. All of the evidence we have for the circulation of Hermetica is Christian. I think Christians wrote it. I don't know if we could show it, but it's a fascinating relationship, and it deserves a lot more study.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Burns. It was also a very good answer for this question. I completely agree. And now this was the last conference of our fourth semester. After that, we are going to make a student gathering and talk about this fourth semester. If you want to join, you can send us an email. And then for the next semester, we can work together. Thank you very much again for every participant, and I wish you a lovely night.
Thank you.
Mm.